Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming and listening to our students' experience with the NHA annual meeting and advocacy day. This was the first time that the Futures Office, with the help and suggestion of Justin Lortz, was actually, we learned about this opportunity and happy to sponsor and send 4 of our humanities students to advocate on behalf of the humanities. So my name is Roshni. For those of you who don't know me, I think if you're a faculty member, we'll soon meet. Matt Roller is arranging a meeting soon. But otherwise, we have Justin here. You may already know him. He's the director of life design, focused on Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, and he has a PhD in history, right? So he's my go-to to understand a lot of what happens in the humanities world, because my background is in biology. So I just wanted to get right in. We're recording the session. So I wanted to ask if each of you, students who attended the conference, if you could please tell us a little bit about yourself, and if you can cover a little bit of your background, what you study right now, and what your plans might be for the future. And we can start with Sade right there on the corner. So go ahead, Sade.
Hi, I'm Sade. I'm a 4th year in the English department. I work on representations of race in the 19th century. And I'm planning on doing both an academic job search and also an alt-ac job search.
Okay. And Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a 4th year student in comparative thought and literature. Similar to Sade, I'm looking both in the academic job market, but also looking at the alternative academic careers and trying to figure out what other possibilities there are for staying in the humanities without necessarily being a professor in the humanities. And so I thought this was a cool opportunity to see how at the humanities were being advocated at a national level.
Ben, you're up.
So my name is Ben Peak. I'm a 5th year in modern languages and literatures in the French section. My background is in secondary education and French language with the idea of being a high school teacher. I'm planning on looking into both the academic world as well as non-traditional paths, specifically in questions of policy and governmental policy.
Excellent. And Alex is Dr. Alex, Dr. Englert now.
Yeah, so I'm Alex Englert. I'm in the philosophy department, and at the end of my 7th year, I defended on March 5th successfully, so I'm finished. And I too am like everyone else. Thanks, Sharon. I this is my first time seeing the little emojis. I've not done too much, so that's funny. Okay, so yeah, I too am also just interested, like the rest of sort of non.
Is he frozen to everybody? All right. Let me stop his video because that usually helps. All right. So while Alex comes back, can you guys tell us a little bit about what the NHA is? What does it stand for today, and what is it all about?
Sure. So the NHA is the National Humanities Alliance. It's basically a big group of organizations across the United States that does advocacy work. It also has recently, and is still working on something called Study the Humanities Initiative. It's looking at, and everyone could talk about this too, but they definitely gave us a lot of information about this study, which is looking at how humanities recruitment happens in the university. And yeah, they're behind the meeting that we went to, and also the advocacy day.
Okay, and Benjamin, can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to apply to this annual meeting and advocacy day?
So when I received the email from Futures, I read through it with a moderate amount of interest, and then I actually Googled the NHA to take a look at what they were and what they did. And immediately when I saw that they were specifically implicated in advocacy for the humanities and for work in the humanities, my interest was piqued just in that that's what I'm aiming towards doing, and what I'm interested in doing is advocating for funding for the humanities. So the minute that I saw that that was the opportunity, I shot off a letter as quick as I could because it was just a very interesting prospect.
How about you, Michael? What was your motivation for actually wanting to attend the day?
Sure. I think originally I got interested because I'm interested in how people are defending or talking about the humanities, making the case for the humanities. Some people don't want to necessarily call it a defense or whatever, however you want to phrase it, but I'm interested in looking at what arguments are being made on behalf of the humanities at different levels, either the institutional level or the pedagogical level, at the level of the classroom, or this, in this case, this was mostly at the level of policy, though we did also talk about things that facing challenges and opportunities facing individuals, institutions. So that was what attracted me, was trying to kind of listen in on conversations that I wasn't otherwise privy to about what kinds of things were being said about the humanities, how the case was being made, and how support from people who might not otherwise be sympathetic to the humanities, was trying to be mobilized on a policy level.
Can you talk a little bit about, Sade, can you talk a little bit about why advocating for the humanities is important to begin with?
Sure. So the humanities, one of the things that was really emphasized for us is that nobody really understands what the humanities are. People just say, it's the humanities, we should fund it or we should do it. And what they found by surveying people, students, parents, high school guidance counselors, faculty members, nobody really understands what the humanities are. And so it's sort of hard to advocate and defend the humanities if you don't understand that. So the work of humanities advocacy is really trying to shine a spotlight on how this thing that we call the humanities does a lot of work, not just for students, but for communities, for veterans, for K through 12 educators and students. In the work of doing this advocacy, what the NHA has done with their Study the Humanities initiative is really try to break down what it means to have resistance to the humanities. And they found that basically across the board, doesn't matter what institution you're at, it could be a public university, a private university, it could be a liberal university, a land-grant university, two-year university, the challenges are kind of the same. And the number one thing that they found was that job prospects are what's driving students away, what makes them leery of the humanities. Also a lack of understanding of what the humanities are, the discouragement of your family members, needing sort of an immediate return on investment on your degree, so being afraid of debt, and then also the admissions pipeline sort of driving away students from the humanities and sort of having more of a emphasis on programs early on when students are just trying to decide their majors, and also a lack of institutional support. So what the NHA did basically was gather all this data, and then what the annual meeting did was try to find solutions to these problems. So advocating for the humanities is important because it means looking at the actual struggles the humanities faces right now. And we can talk about the various solutions too that came out during during the Advocacy Day meeting versus the advocacy work on the Capitol Hill that we did.
Okay.
All right, that was a lot.
Okay. And Benjamin, did you want to add to it? Because you have an underlying interest in policy anyway and advocacy. Could you sort of add some more information to that as well?
So everything that Sade has just said is very, very pertinent. It was interesting to see during the few days that we were doing this, the kind of rubber meets the road mentality of the people that were there. It's all well and good to be humanists and to be doing our own work and our own research, but what does that mean kind of concretely in the numbers? And particularly me as a literature student, I don't tend to look at the numbers too very frequently. So it was meaningful to see kind of questions of how the policy is formed through the nuts and bolts and the nickels and the dimes, and what kind of education about the education needed to be done to be able to present that information in a meaningful way. That's really what I took away from this process, was how do you speak to someone who has really no point of reference or very little point of reference for the work that a humanist does, and how can you make that work meaningful to them in a way that they can then take back and say, well, the nickels and the dimes equal this, and return on investment is a very important term to bring out, and I'm really grateful that Sade brought that out, because that was kind of one of the sort of keystone terms that we had throughout the entire weekend, was what is the return on investment in these things? So crafting the dialogue around a completely different type of vocabulary was a very interesting exercise and a very meaningful thing to learn.
You guys made it right before the quarantine COVID stuff hit. I was hoping and praying that you guys are okay. Can you talk a little bit about the structure of the meeting itself? Like when did you go and how long the meeting was and all that? Alex, we'll give you a try and hopefully you don't freeze up. But if you do, just try turning your video off. That helps with the internet as well. So could you tell
Okay.
us a little bit about the structure as well?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry about it. And I don't think it's our internet's been sort of in and out. So, but yeah, so the first 2 days were essentially workshops based around the sort of plan and issues that Sade was talking about. And it was in a nice hotel and sort of the various sort of conference rooms. And you had various choices about which panels you could sit in on, but they were all devoted to the same basic question about A, how do we save the humanities and get more majors, and B, how do we convince politicians that they should be on board with funding humanities programs. And then on the third day, we were sort of thrown into the deep end and asked to actually go to senators and delegates, representatives' offices and plead that they sign dear colleague letters. And for me personally, just I didn't really know until the week leading up to that I was signing up to actually advocate. And I'm really thankful that I ended up doing it.
Yeah.
But I was so nervous because I thought it was just going to be sort of a, info session about, hey, this is what we do, and here's some people who've done it. And then we get there, and it's essentially a boot camp where they had various breakout sessions where you were supposed to go, and they had people do sort of mock interviews or sort of like play scenes to see how a successful meeting with a senator might go and an unsuccessful meeting. And but then it was up to you to sort of figure out how that was going to play out. And as someone who'd never done that before, I was very nervous.
So you don't have to sort of set up your own meetings with the senators. They set it up for you.
They set up the meetings, and you were grouped based off of what sort of state you were coming from. So we all were in Maryland, and we had a pretty big group. And then the day before, we had a breakout session where we met with everyone else who was from Maryland, and we all sort of divvied up who was going to go to whom. And yeah.
So we'll talk about that experience in a second. But before that, during the workshops and the meetings, what kind of people did you meet? Who did you meet? How was a networking opportunity for you guys? Did you make a lot of contacts? I know there were pictures of you guys meeting with various people. In fact, the poster that I prepared was with you guys sitting with Beatrice and a few others. Can you tell us a little bit of who you met and how networking was for you during the workshop period? Michael?
Me again?
I can ask Michael.
Sure. It was very diverse group. I think the major representatives, the major kind of constituencies that were represented were faculty members at different humanities departments, usually some kind of administrator, so either the chair of a humanities department or the kind of director of graduate studies or something like this, director of undergraduate studies. Then there was humanist institutions. We had somebody in the Maryland group from the American Philosophical Association. We had somebody from the American Sociological Association. There were other kinds of groups. There were representatives from humanities centers across the country. So maybe not a department per se, but kind of something like our Alexander Grass Institute, the kind of equivalent, I think, at other places. Administrators from those kinds of programs. And then administrators from universities too. So deans and vice deans and this kind of role that had some purview over the humanities. And a lot of the institutions were, a lot of the universities represented were very diverse as well. Like Sade mentioned, they had 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, research universities, liberal arts colleges, small state schools, large state schools. So it was a big, it was a diverse group. I think the networking, there was potential based on what your there was potential based on what you're kind of were interested in looking at and looking for. But I don't know. I think others might speak, may have more to say about the specific networking opportunities that they had, in terms of meaningful connections that they might have made. But I think for me, it was mostly just trying to see how all these players were coming together and how their interests intersected or diverged from one another and this kind of thing. And especially for those, you know, kind of the administrators and the faculty, what kind of maybe frictions existed and this kind of thing.
Okay. Sade, did you keep in touch with some of the folks that you met after?
Yeah, so we had a really nice lunch, a 3-course meal lunch, where we had a chance to talk to people. I was talking to somebody from the American Schools of Oriental Research. He did say that they were thinking of changing the name, but he was the person I was sitting next to. I also got to see some people from the Folger, who I'm in touch with, and Folger Shakespeare Library. Definitely got some cards that I put in my bag and have yet to take out again, but there was a lot of opportunity, I think, to meet people. We sent each other like pictures immediately after that we had been taking the whole day. It's a fun photo opportunity to go under the tunnels of Congress, to say that. Yeah.
Okay, I think Justin is going to jump in with a question.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, you guys are in some ways sort of an experimental group. We're the first institution to sort of sponsor graduate students to attend this. It's not something that they even really considered until we asked. You know, and I guess maybe I'll ask Ben this. I mean, do you feel like this was helpful in your own professional development, in your own sort of development as a scholar, you know, sort of learning about this, going to going to this event, learning how to advocate? Was it something that was useful to you?
I love that question because it's probably my favorite response. I can, without a doubt, concretely 100% say yes. So there are different aspects to the response to this. First off, there's the question of how does one have a dialogue with people that have been in their careers for so many years and have so much kind of expertise and experience with these certain questions. What does it mean to have a meaningful dialogue like that? And learning to just have a frank conversation about questions that are really existential for everything that we do was meaningful, first off. Second off, I mean, going back to the question of networking, I have people that I met there that I still was texting with them yesterday, questions about, you know, things that we were doing. And it was really interesting, the different questions that were being asked, especially seeing kind of generational divides about ways that one might go around responding to certain questions. And I see Sade is kind of smiling because there was a specific moment in the discussion where we were talking about, well, how can we bring students into our discussions, our conversations and things like that? And I kind of piped up and perhaps naively at the time said, well, why haven't we ever considered live streaming these events to things like YouTube or, you know, crazily twitch.tv where the students are? And everyone got a good chuckle out of that. But 3 days later, campuses across the United States were starting to close down and suddenly everybody had to go digital. And so these sorts of really concrete questions were very meaningful. I will say that as someone who's going into this realm as a future professional, this was one of the more meaningful experiences that I've had during my training at Hopkins, was the ability to go and have these one-on-one discussions, have these meetings and create these connections with people that, you know, will move forward in my career. It was without a doubt 100% a meaningful and worthwhile experience.
Can I say something about the workshops?
Yeah.
So I think whether you're thinking about alt-ac or thinking about going on a faculty track in the academic market, there was a lot in the workshops that I think were useful. I went to one on curricular innovation, and they brought people who had received NEH grants and were implementing them in different ways at their universities. There was somebody from the University of Pittsburgh who had a project called Water in Central Eurasia. And that project that was created was linking the humanities to the sciences and created, I think, a certificate program, and we're addressing some of the things that I think all universities are struggling with, and are specifically things that faculty members or graduate students can be involved in. There was also somebody from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, who had funding for something called High Impact Humanities, where faculty members were given $5,000 to develop a course that would really reach students in a hands-on way. So, for example, going to a whaling museum while reading Moby Dick, that kind of thing. And so from a faculty member, they actually also had specifically a faculty member based thinking about the humanities and sort of approaches to humanities workshop that you could attend versus like advocating at a state level workshop. So I went to the faculty one, and it was really revealing, I think, about the sort of challenges that you don't necessarily see until you're a faculty member. And I learned a lot from that. There's also a documenting humanities impact on campus, a research methodology workshop that, again, I think it was a lot of faculty members there who were trying to figure out how to sort of see the impact of the programs that they had initiated. How do you sort of see that your programs are actually working once you've actually, spearheaded something that's really cool? So that was all, I think, really useful for an academic track in the profession, and as well as the things that were there for thinking about advocacy as a future, or working for the NEH, or working for a cultural organization.
Okay.
Just a quick follow-up question, maybe Michael, you can answer. I mean, but how familiar before going to this, how familiar were you guys with, the different sources of funding for the humanities, how decisions around funding for humanities within an institution are made? Was a lot of this information new, or did you have any kind of base of knowledge going into it?
Personally, I didn't know that much about federal funding for the humanities. And it definitely seemed like the meeting was kind of bifurcated in the sense that it felt like a lot of our advocacy work was somehow almost selfless, kind of like most of the people there weren't advocating for funding on their own behalf. They were it was kind of like a mutually beneficial arrangement where the people who were at the meeting could be mobilized to fundraise, basically, or solicit support for an organization that might not directly impact them and their work, but would broadly support the humanities. And so I think that as people have already mentioned, the kind of two-pronged approach to the meeting in general. On the one hand, what are the institutional challenges and sources of funding and supports and solutions that we have, and then what are the what's going on at the national level? And they were kind of separated, and I think that was intentional. I think that was actually useful to see those two aspects. And just going back to your earlier question really quick about what was valuable and the role of graduate students in particular, if I can, it definitely felt to me like a kind of shadowing experience almost, which I thought was really cool, because you don't think about it that much. Maybe graduate school is a kind of professorial shadowing in and of itself. But we got to shadow a different kind of aspect of what it might mean to go into the humanities, especially at an administrative level. And I thought that was kind of cool, about becoming insiders to conversations that were not normally, and how can we mobilize undergraduate support, and how can we mobilize institutional support, and how can we get federal funding, and these kind of things that you don't think about as being included in the profession because it's not part of the research per se. So I thought shadowing that aspect and the candor of the administrators and the faculty members was appreciated as well. They didn't shy away from going into the challenges because you were a grad student and they didn't want to scare you off or something. They kind of would say, don't worry, you can handle this. Like you'll do okay with these kind of challenges too when it's your turn. So that mentorship aspect and the shadowing aspect were useful for me as well. But to your main question about funding and mostly what we were advocating for was the National Endowment for the Humanities. I didn't really know much about it, to be honest, but it was interesting to see some of the projects that they were funding around the country.
Very cool.
Before we get into the Capitol Hill visit and the juicy stuff, and on the last day, Mary has a question. Go ahead, Mary.
Thank you. And I have to say, it's just so heartening to hear you guys talk with such enthusiasm and articulacy about the experience. That's fantastic. I guess I just want a simple question. You talked a lot about initially about how people don't in general know what the humanities are. What answer did you come up with? I mean, did you arrive at a sort of satisfactory explanation for the humanities, and did everybody share it, or were there some differences of opinion on what counted as humanities? I'm going to ask you today, since I'm
Okay. So I think that one of the things that got really highlighted during this meeting that I actually think a lot of people in humanities might be resistant to is the idea of marketing the humanities.
Right.
And that's something that like kept coming up. The idea that like in order to have people understand what the humanities are and get people interested in them and make them more accessible and make them more robust, you have to sort of demystify, and you have to actually do the work of marketing them. You have to sort of go out there and talk about the programs in a way that is appealing, as opposed to a way that I think we sort of normally think about our research or our class development or our projects. I don't know, you guys have any other?
So how do you market it? I mean, what do you say?
Yeah,
I was just going to add that, you know, others will have other tangents, and this isn't an exact answer, but I was going to say, because it was one of my initial interests, as I mentioned at the beginning, about, you know, how was this group trying to justify the humanities and these kind of things. It was actually interesting to me, some of the reluctance with which they wanted to engage this question in general. Because to me personally, it seemed like they seemed to think that the best case for the humanities was everyone's own individual work. That whatever you're teaching and writing and working on, this is our kind of, this is what the humanities is, this is what the humanities has been. In that sense, I think it was a little bit of a conservative approach, if I could call it that, of a kind of like, what we're already doing is what the humanities is. And what we need to do is try to create visibility and to create a language which will be able to bring people into that already extant field, as it were. So this was how I saw the conversation being framed there. And around the humanities recruitment survey that Sade was talking about, they gave us a little booklet. And these are the kinds of questions that they were asking about. How can we engage different audiences? Or what is driving students away from the humanities? But there was actually, in my opinion, maybe others had different views, but there was actually a kind of intentional reluctance to engage a question about what is the humanities and how could we reshape our own practices, you know, to be more engaging and more appealing or something like this. It was more of, to me, it was more of a, what we're doing is what humanities is, how can we open people to that, and how can we create, you know, a different language. That people were talking, for example, about how we could switch our course titles to be more appealing, but, you know, kind of keep the same everything, you know, all the pedagogical stuff remains the same, but how can we kind of, you know, maybe use a more accessible language in our course title, our course description, to get people to come into it. So I thought this was the level that they engaged that question, but maybe others had different.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think they also, so one lesson in marketing I think that I took away was when we were thinking about how to frame the request to the Congress people for this money, we ended up looking at like the NEH grants database and sort of seeing what grants did this district receive, and then sort of tried to distill those grants into what would be most appealing. And that in itself was an exercise in the humanities I don't think I've ever done before. Like this idea of how do you make this person who might not care at all about the humanities care about the humanities? And so when we went to talk to Jamie Raskin, for example, who very clearly cared about the humanities, he had Shakespeare all over his walls, had theater things in his office in Congress, it was great. But for him, we talked about the Veterans Metrics Initiative, and that's not something you would think of normally as a humanities project. It was more, I was doing some like far more quantitative work, I think, than we tend to think of it as being a humanities project. But we talked about veterans, the work that did, who else was collaborating with that project, and that sort of distillation is something that the NEH, I think, is really good at doing in their booklets, where they have it like down pat, where like this is a humanities thing, but actually it's affecting K through 12. And here's an actual example of it. They're really great about tweeting about their programs too, which is I think something that the humanities is engaging more and more in, the sort of humanities work on Twitter. But also another thing that they really stressed was audience, not just, again, like Michael was saying, changing your titles to suit your audience, but also thinking of audiences to market to that you might not normally think of. For example, high school guidance counselors, parents who were, I think, the number 3 issue with getting humanities recruitment was like, what will my family say? So are you sort of marketing the humanities to that specific audience, sort of breaking it down in a way that I think that, like Michael was saying, we're kind of resisting doing that, breaking down and really thinking about that.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Alex, you had a comment? You'd raised your hand earlier.
Yeah. So I just sort of also in response to Mary's question is the whole thing sort of began with a guy who got up, and I forget where he was from, but he was a history professor, and he asked us all and said, I ask you to think about not why the humanities are relevant, but why the humanities are useful. And his point was, he went on and said, relevance is a very low bar. There's it's a low threshold, right? A lot of things are relevant, but the question is, what are they useful for? And we were at different breakout sessions, and I never was at one where the actual meaning of the humanities was discussed, but I was at one early on the first day where it was very much about this marketing component. And we sat in, and there was it was all about brainstorming and writing out together with all these professors ways of sort of recruiting. And the humanities were defined more about the sort of characteristic uses that they have for jobs in the future. So the ability to communicate orally and in written form, and the way of sort of being a critical thinker. And that was where Ben, I think, brought up the Twitch or the live streaming. And there were also ideas thrown around of keeping in touch with alumni and bringing the alumni back who'd actually succeeded in getting jobs, even though they were an English major or a art history major, and explaining why what they learned was valuable. And so I was very much on that side. And one of the there was an administrator there, and he brought up, I forget which university he was from, but his dream is to create sort of an Amazon of humanities courses, where students, when they're going through course offerings, will get selections of oh, you took intro to philosophy, you might also and have this sort of I don't know, technological big brother aspect of selling the humanities to students. So, I mean, it ranged all over the place from that to more sort of traditional, just, how do you sell the humanities to your students and get them interested?
But and so it sounds like, I'm just sorry. Well, it sounds like the rationale there was basically, yes, we have to convince people that you can get a job with humanities, and that going to college is, you go to college in order to get a job.
Right.
It seems to be buying into that logic fully.
And if I can just bounce off of what everybody else has said, that's very much the way that it was packaged to us, in the way that we were looking at things. Again, I come back to the questions of the kind of nuts and bolts and nickels and dimes of things. My first meeting on the Hill was actually with the one Republican member of Congress, Peter Harris, his staff. And I remember kind of sitting down with my team, and we were kind of bracketing out how we were going to go about the meeting. And it really came down to exactly like Sede was saying. We went through the database of the money and the funding that was given by the NEH to that specific district, and the percentage of that for this percentage of Maryland. And it was something that, as someone who is, you know, a PhD student in French Lit, I don't tend to think about these sorts of questions, but it did cause me to kind of step back and re-examine some things. And it made me go back to my days of the School of Education, where I did my teacher training, and kind of, how do I get this person to realize that what I do is important and it could have impact on what they're doing? That's the usefulness question. Now, I've always felt like I'm a bit of a cheater. I teach French and French literature, so I always have that ability to say, well, I'm teaching a foreign language and I'm teaching a foreign culture. So I'm teaching a competency and a literacy. And then my brain came back to the word literacy. And that's kind of where I think the kind of keystone of what we could do to help not necessarily redefine, but reimagine the humanities is, what does it mean to be literate? What does it mean to be literate beyond the realm of what we do in our own fields? I mean, I study 19th and 20th century French literature, images of walking in French literature and natural spaces. That is so precise that there are, you know, 7 or 8 other people in the world that are really interested in that question. However, what does that mean for my ability to teach a literacy within the context of a language, within the context of a culture? And so how can that then be taken and translated to all of the other humanities, subjects within the humanities? And so one of the bigger takeaways that I've had from this entire experience is exactly that. How do we allow ourselves to kind of reimagine what it means to be a professor and what it means to do the research with this kind of look forward towards a question of helping people understand the importance of literacy within the context of all the different fields. So that's kind of my answer to, how do you define the humanities? Well, the humanities is training in literacy, and that is an infinitely translatable skill.
Sharon, did you want to, you had your hand raised earlier and your comment sort of ties into the conversation now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been in 4 institutions during many periods of austerity and difficulty and defensiveness about the humanities. And we're in a particularly austere moment. And I'm very pleased that you guys are learning skills and figuring out what are the political mechanisms. So I'm really pleased that you're taking on this extra work that's so important and getting training in it. I suppose that I've been in different cultures and different institutions, and the argument for usefulness is, of course, extremely important skills, literacy, critical thinking for jobs. When I was teaching at Oxford University, I had to explain to parents why it was okay that their kids were studying English. I mean, that's at Oxford, and you think, oh my gosh, and you know, will they ever get a job? And there's all sorts of needs to explain that to undergraduates and their parents and all of this. But I think it's amazing right now how much those scenes of the Italians on their balcony singing the arias is what people want. So that the importance of not forgetting that saving someone's life is not because you're a car mechanic saving a machine, you're saving a human being. And I think that I still come back to that grounded place. It sounds very idealistic and airy, but I think we have to try to modify the conversation so that it's not only about cash and about jobs and about bottom lines and marketing, but about humans need meaning and humans find meaning in expressivity through culture. And I think we've got to remember that that's not something to hide, that's what makes a life worth living. So that's my only comment. I just don't know how much you heard of that there. And I know it sounds, obviously Jamie Raskin is like, yeah. And how does it work when you're talking to a veteran? But there are ways of communicating that aren't just completely theoretical and philosophically complex. They're very down-to-earth ways. And you know, right now during the virus, everyone is watching the singing and performing arts and watching a hell of a lot of Netflix, which are written by a hell of a lot of English majors. So there's that.
Anne Elizabeth was looking for a heart emoji, she says, for your comment, Sharon. So thank you. We do have a question from Alexandra in the chat box. Alexandra, do you want to ask that question, or did you want me to ask it on your behalf? I'll go ahead if I don't see you turn your video on, but What is the one essential thing that you would like graduate students to know from your experiences? What would you like faculty members to know, especially given that we seem to be entering a period of financial austerity at Hopkins due to COVID-19? That's a question to you guys. Today, do you want to try going for it first?
Sure. So in terms of one of the really great, I'll start with maybe Sharon's first. One of the really great things about being in this space is that a lot of the love and the respect for the humanities was a given, if that makes sense. Like, people were like, we know this is valuable for reasons that are deeply like relevant to our society. I use the relevant word, but it's true. Like, right, like, yes, the arts are important, the humanities are important. How do we sort of drive it through the heads of other people so that we can then do more of this work and let people have more of a way into it? And I think that some people were more or less receptive to that when we went out into the Capitol to talk about it. Some people did respond better to like some of the facts that I didn't know, that, for example, the NEH has a 3-to-1 impact factor of like, for every dollar it's that's given, it raises like so much more money through private donors. And that was an important fact. I think that the math part of it, the cash part of it, was important, sort of getting across that point. But there were also really great stories about the sort of the humanity of the humanities, how it affected people. One of the anecdotes that was shared was talking about how when veterans were reading the Odyssey, what that meant to them in their recovery from PTSD. So that was, I think, we maybe in this session we're talking more about like the nuts and the bolts of it, as I think somebody said, but that respect for the humanities and that appreciation for the humanities was there throughout, I think. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in with more on that before we go to Alexander's question.
Well, in one of the breakout sessions, I actually used exactly that statement where I said, you know, one of the best ways to sell the humanities is to put the human back in humanities and to let people realize the importance of what it means to connect with the humanness of what we do. And every single person at the table kind of looked at me and said, well, that's a given. That's like, everybody knows that. And it's like, well, okay, that's all well and good. The people that we're about to go and talk to don't necessarily know that. And so, you know, I completely agree with the idea of bringing back this kind of rootedness and what you said in your comment in the chat, Sharon, is absolutely true, that's what makes what the humanities do for us. It makes life worth living. And the issue is that people have lost sight of that. And so when I talked about literacy, that's kind of my bait and switch. It's my magician's trick of like, I'll put the word literacy out there, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to swoop it off the table and make you realize that being human and connecting at an emotional level with these things is really the importance. And that's what it means to be literate. So I just wanted to say that I completely agree, and Sid is absolutely right. 90% of the people that we spoke with were 100% on board with the fact that that's why we do what we do. In the political meetings, it was a little bit different. You know, there was a different tact that needed to be used to be able to get in and have a meaningful dialogue. But, you know, most people were absolutely agreeing that this is what is the kind of essence of what we do.
I would love to hear more about these political meetings, sort of like the going on Capitol Hill and sort of advocating, especially if especially hearing about some of the conversations you might have had with skeptical lawmakers who don't sort of buy into the value of the humanities, that you had to convince them. I'd love to hear how that went.
Maybe just slightly before we pivot, I'd love to respond to both Sharon and Alexander, if that's okay.
Sure.
I just thought that Sharon made a good point, and that I actually kind of disagreed with not disagreed, but had a slightly different take than the other respondents, because I think that actually the ethos of the meeting itself was kind of formed in such a way that encouraged us to shy away from appreciating the humanities in a full sense. And so I think that a lot of times when the professors and faculty members would say, of course, yes, this is a given, that was a kind of way of deflecting from their own interests and more tangible questions around funding and these kind of things. I think there actually was, I think the ethos, I would have liked to seen the ethos a little bit more like of a blue sky kind of ethos, or of a more of a you know, far-ranging kind of vision, as opposed to a lot of people, it seemed to me like a lot of people signed up for the meeting because they're having, you know, they need to get their enrollments up from an average of 8 to an average of 10.2. And this is why they're really coming to the meeting, is to try to figure out how to solve these very practical institutional questions, which then makes sense that this ethos is going to be kind of a technocratic ethos around the humanities, about how we can improve enrollments and how we can improve our marketing and these kind of things. I'm kind of the persuasion that if you ask the big questions more often in more interesting ways, then the technocratic ones will kind of find solutions of themselves, but that didn't seem to be the prevailing opinion of the group. What I thought was interesting, though, as a graduate student there, you know, I felt my role wasn't to change the conversation of a meeting that I had never been to and was not really even, you know, this is the first time they've ever had graduate students, but just to kind of listen and kind of be that, you know, see what the conversation was about, and see what, see how people are talking about it. And this kind of links into Alex's question about what is it essential that I would like graduate students to know. And I think one of the things that we talked about amongst ourselves, the four of us, when we were at the meeting, was just how kind of privileged of a position we were in at Hopkins, because a lot of the challenges that people were, you know, most of the universities represented there I hadn't even heard of before. They're kind of smaller places with very different challenges, I think, you know, related but different. And so I remember one conversation, for example, about co-teaching, and about how co-teaching at most of the universities represented was not even allowed because it was considered a waste of resources, because you couldn't have 2 faculty members, only 1 classroom, because your enrollments wouldn't go up per faculty member. And I don't, you know, maybe it's difficult to co-teach at Hopkins, but I know it's not completely prohibited because I've taken several co-teaching classes. But I just thought that one of the essential things that graduate students should know is that it could be that the institutional issues facing the humanities at the institutions that we've been in, undergraduate, graduate, whatever, may not be the ones that we're going to face exactly when we, if and when we get academic jobs. You know, if you get a job at some of these universities, you're going to be facing very different institutional support issues, have very different criteria on what's your teaching load. Is co-teaching allowed? Can graduate students even teach? Do you get a TA? How much time do you need to, you know, spend on your teaching versus research? Just all these kinds of questions. I think it was eye-opening for me, at least, to see how faculty members operate in different kind of contexts. So that's my kind of take on Alex and Sharon's, and didn't mean to distract from Justin's important question about resistances. Personally, for me, I went to all Democratic senators who had pretty much already signed all of the letters that we were advocating for. So it's pretty easy on my front. I don't know if others had more resistance, but pretty much in Maryland, we only had the 1 Republican representative. Everybody else is a Democrat in Maryland. And they were pretty much all on board with the NEH funding on my side.
I just like to follow up and say that I would second Michael's impression about how I thought it was sort of, it was underrepresented, the sort of why the humanities are important as such. And there was an overemphasis on commodifying the humanities and making it a product that we could sell, which was something that I honestly, at first, I also agree with Michael that I was just sort of there to listen at first and understand what was going on. And that was one of the eye-opening things, is that I think that for so many departments, it's a fight for survival right now. And that's why they're putting this emphasis on how best to sell themselves, which might, you know, yeah, I don't know if it's actually going to help them or hurt them, or if they're just sort of playing to a game with rules that are always going to be set up to sort of to the detriment of the humanities, where it's just so hard to quantify the benefits of doing it. Which I think gets to Sharon's point, is that that stuff's so essential and so important that it's almost taken for granted by everybody. And just to Alexandra's two questions, I think for grad students, I'd say that I'd second what most people here say. It's just so important to tell your grad students to do this sort of thing. I learned so much, and it's just nice to see behind the curtain at the policy side what the discussion is and what other institutions are facing, like Michael said. And for faculty, I would say it was nice to have that sort of honesty, and I wish that I got that more from my Hopkins faculty, that I knew more of what the challenges they were facing are, and just sort of how much of a meat grinder it can be to be a faculty person and have to go to meetings where it's about faculty lines and tenure. And I know in the philosophy department, we've always been trying to sort of, as grad students, get a seat at the table with no voting rights, of course, but just to be present and find out what it's actually like to be a faculty member in the aspects that don't pertain directly to just teaching. And we've always been sort of rebuffed in our attempts and not been able to get that. So that was really helpful. And I think it would be helpful for students here, even if they don't go to this sort of workshop or conference.
I'd like to also add one thing about the job situation for undergraduates. The data that they were presenting us with, I think it does shed a light on what students are concerned about. The number one obstacle for them to really engage with the humanities, to get degrees in the humanities, is this fear of not having a job when you come out of it. And a lot of the other things, when they asked students and families and faculty members and institutions, what are you worried about? The job thing is important. Families saying you're not going to get a job is important. I think that window into what students are concerned about is something that faculty members, graduate students, we can sort of respond to and think about, how do we balance this love for the humanities and appreciation for what the humanities can do for us as people with the very real realities of the world, right? Like, how do we sort of balance that? And they had some interesting solutions to that came up, which are feasible at some universities and not others. For example, humanities internships that work with a course. So you're doing community humanities work. That can give you the skills then to go on and do more work in the humanities, or maybe not work in the humanities, but at least feel like you have not just given yourself, an amazing experience reading a great book or doing deep analysis, but also taking something away from that you can use to get a job, which I think it's fair to highlight the students' concerns and think about that as an obstacle to doing the humanities work. And I will absolutely agree with everything that everybody has said about the sort of shock of seeing institutions that don't have anywhere near the resources that we do, and the sort of tactics that they're thinking about using and have used. And that was immensely useful as a graduate student to see. But I do think maybe the most important thing for me as a graduate student taking away from this was that there are paths to do work in the humanities, the work that I love, that don't have to be academic paths necessarily. The number of institutions that came up, societies, libraries, museums, archives, places that we may or may not think of in terms of looking for a job in the humanities. It's not like you have to give up the humanities if you're not doing an academic job. There are other pathways. And I think that was a really useful thing to take away from this.
Justin.
Yeah, so I think, since we're sort of wrapping up on time, it'd be helpful, and that we can certainly continue this conversation, since all four of you seem to feel like this is a really valuable experience. I'm very jealous of my science colleagues, because I think science communication, science advocacy, is such ingrained in doctoral training in science. And I think a lot of students understand that there's a path there. They understand more about the funding process. And so thinking about what as in, both Roshni and myself, but also Hopkins as the institution, can bring back to the humanities doctoral, population at large, in terms of programming, in terms of resources, that all humanities students, even if they can't, attend this conference, are able to attend programs, able to attend events, to understand some of these things, to at least understand the national landscape, better understand the landscape of funding at their university at Hopkins and how humanities are funded at Hopkins. So I would love, we don't have time now to sort of to continue this conversation going forward, to see about what we can do moving forward to continue to continue this conversation and get more graduate students in the humanities involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Benjamin, were you about to jump in and say something? Just 3 minutes left. So Anne does have a comment, but Benjamin, you were about to say something, then we'll go to Anne's comment.
Sorry, I'm just reading through Anne's comment right now, which is a pertinent comment, and I've actually read that inside the higher education study. It's very interesting. And I agree that the perception, there's a perception of one thing and then a reality of another. So that's a very pertinent comment that could be discussed at greater length. First off, I think that going to Justin's comment, I think that this conference, this annual meeting, should be kind of a hallmark of something that graduate students should be able to do at Hopkins. I think that we should continue sending students, first off, because the one thing that I think that each of us felt while we were there was every time we would go and we'd say, yeah, we're PhD students at Johns Hopkins, the immediate reaction was, oh my gosh, it's so wonderful that they're sending graduate students. So kind of going back to a previous question, what can faculty take away from this? It is the fact that graduate students' voices are very important as part of the process. And I think that that's something that we should take away. Continuing the conversation, I mean, I don't know for the others, but personally, I would love to sit down and talk with just about anybody that would want to hear about these, because the one kind of nugget that I took away was from somebody that I met from Baltimore City Community College that I spent a lot of time working with. He was fantastic. And he said, Ben, the important thing is to show up. The important thing is to be here and make yourself known and make the questions and the information that you have and the important issues that you have known. And that's really the kind of takeaway, is those that get things done are those that will show up. And I was very proud to be with the other three, because we all went there and I feel that we did good work. It was a fun process. So, I mean, continuing the conversation is to just get as many people out there to be willing to listen, so that they understand the importance of just showing up.
And that's a perfect note to sort of conclude this conversation, and we're going to leave it at that. It's exactly 1 o'clock. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your perspectives, and thank you for those who joined to listen. This recording will be available on YouTube, and I'll send you guys the link later on if you want. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks
very
much.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.